You are live.
Available live. It's the Senate Education Committee of February 7th, 2 o'clock, after a quick break, after hearing from the University of Vermont. And now we're shifting gears to just further work on the education transformation proposal from the administration. And today, I think we're focusing on governance in particular, right? So we'll just for, I know we all know each other at this point, but just for in case people are watching, go around the room.
Senator Keisha Brown Hinsdale, Chittenden Southeast.
Not a Shane Wyndham County.
Dave Weeks, serving welcome. So one of us Bennington Senate District. Terry Williams, serving welcome.
Steve Heffernan, service.
And then you introduce yourselves and off we go.
I'm Zoe Saunders, Secretary of Education.
Jill Briggs Campbell, Interim Deputy Secretary of Education.
Off we go.
Okay. Thank you so much for having us this afternoon. Today we'll talk about the Governor Scott's Education Transformation Plan. As we've said from the beginning, this plan looked at three policy levers that are interconnected in terms of funding, governance, and education quality. All of those are very much organized around a focus on promoting equity for students and for taxpayers. So today we'll talk about the governance component. We'll start by writing an overview of the current context, describe the principles of this approach. We'll walk through some more of the detail around the rationale for the proposal for 5 districts, and also talk about the local school advisory councils and their role in the overall education ecosystem. So the intent of the governance changes is really to optimize support, promote equitable budgeting, foster local engagement, and develop a cohesive education ecosystem that is built upon strong public schools. We approach this work by centering all of our recommendations around students, and thinking specifically around what are the resources that schools need to support delivering a wide range of educational programs and a whole child approach. We are proposing changes to governance at multiple levels. So that includes changes at the state, district, and school level to build that alignment and centering all that work again around equity and educational opportunities. Particularly with governance, we've thought a lot about establishing criteria for accountability, shared responsibility, while promoting creativity. So this slide is one that we have gone back to over the course of our presentations of the last several weeks. And just as a reminder, we've talked a lot so far around the funding component of it, and what was baked into the base is really intentional on delivering education quality. There are assumptions around scale in order for us to be able to deliver that range of services for students at the funding amounts that we're putting forward. So we'll talk a little bit more today around what that looks like. I want to acknowledge we presented the report yesterday. So in addition to this presentation, you have access to a more complete report that goes into the details around the proposal. And we know that there have been a lot of questions since we released the report yesterday. So specifically, there's been, I think, a misconception that this proposal is a voucher program. That is not at all how this program is designed. The program is designed to strengthen our public education system, and that is why the funding amount has a very generous base. We're assuming that there's a lot of important educational services that needs to be delivered within that funding, and that can be achieved at scale. There's also, I think, been a misconception that this approach is designed to really increase the number of independent schools within our education ecosystem. This proposal assumes that there will continue to be a moratorium on new independent schools. And the most critical part of this proposal is that it is about shared accountability and making sure that we are responsible in investing public dollars in a way that's going to support academic excellence and ensure that those dollars are invested in a way to build very strong public schools for students, and think about where they can have additional options to meet their interests. So I just want to pause there just to clarify, because I think there's been a lot of misconceptions. Also implicit in this approach is that tuition dollars would not be going out of state. So this proposal is around investing Vermont dollars in strengthening Vermont's public schools and allowing for educational options that make sense within each district and would be aligned to the enrollment and the population of students in those districts. And we can talk more around what that application process would look like. We know there's been a lot of question around that, and we can continue to expand today.
Okay, can you go back one slide? Getting a lot of questions about the rollout of the plan. I think we're at step 2 right now. That's today, modern governance and scale. Is that
I think we'll
And
get
then-
step 3 as well a little bit.
okay? And then so 4 and 5, couple weeks, so that, you know, like by the end of not this next week, but the week after, like what, do you have a notion so folks
Yes.
understand?
Setting clear expectations. So absolutely, as you look through this approach, I would say we can check the box for the education funding. We've provided a lot of detail around that, and some of the finance committees, money committees are really getting into the detail around that. Today, we'll talk about governance and scale. We've already started to talk about guardrails for budgeting. That's implicit within our funding model. And so we've called out some of those assumptions within the base funding. Improving education quality and equity. We will talk about that today in terms of some of the key components of that process. We will have more detail around that next week and getting really specific on what are the core and high quality education standards and how will we measure financial solvency. But we have identified that those are the 2 primary areas that will form the shared accountability framework. And then tax relief, that is really achieved through us becoming a more efficient system. And so we've talked through that as we've gone through the funding approach, and the governor has also signaled a plan to buy down property tax. So I would say after today, we've gone through all the components of the plan, and then over the next couple of weeks, there's going to be some more detail around policy decisions related to education quality.
Thank you.
I think I have an extremely basic question, but like people will be concerned I'm even asking this maybe, but when we say a moratorium on independent schools, can if we only control a moratorium on them getting any funding, right? Someone can set up an independent school, or we have a moratorium on like no new schools can be created.
It's a moratorium on tuition.
It's a moratorium on tuition, okay. Because I all of a sudden I was like, wait, we don't get to tell
On approvals. Yeah, unapproved independent.
approvals. So they can't operate as an accredited educational
Sorry.
institution.
Let's back up. I was confusing. Go ahead.
Yeah, so we're assuming that there'll continue to be a moratorium on new independent schools being approved to receive public dollars.
Right, okay, all of a sudden,
And
I just wanted to, like,
That
they
doesn't
can be.
prevent
for-
an independent school from conforming or
Right.
for a parent to pay
Uh-huh.
private tuition to
Okay.
attend that school. The
Right.
conversations we're having around where do we invest state dollars?
Right, okay, all of a sudden, I was like, they can do what they want, they can
Yes,
see a
of course.
school and that operates outside of our governance.
All we're talking about here is as how we're really investing public dollars.
Yes, okay,
To ensure high quality education for students across the state of Vermont.
Before we actually see a lot of hands up.
Yeah.
Does it make sense for us to let you go or how?
Yep.
And then ask questions or along the way or?
I think so. I know that there's been a lot of questions around this, so I wanted to make sure that we address those head on. And then as we go through the presentation, we can get into more details.
So, would
So
you rather have
we could-
questions along the way or have us wait?
I think it'd be good to go through the presentation
Okay.
and then ask questions. Does that work for you? Senator Reese is
No, it's-
patient. So if you have a
It's fine.
specific.
It's, well, I want to let you, yeah, let's, because you
Okay.
have, I know you have to.
Okay.
I'm thinking some of the questions will get answered as we go. So
Yes,
we can-
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we'll start just with a summary of what we're going to walk through today. This proposal contemplates a more simplified governance model. It eliminates the supervisory union structure and moves from 119 school districts to 5 districts. We want to talk about how we arrived at 5. It did not just happen by chance. There was a lot of thought put into achieving the optimum scale, and we'll walk through our rationale for that. We will also talk about the use of education support agencies. Typically in the Vermont context, those have been referred to as BOCES. We understand that there is a need for specialized services, and we're going to talk about where we see that positioned within this revised governance framework. Within this work, we'll also talk about the role of the Agency of Education and the State Board of Education. All of these decisions are really organized around what we're hoping to achieve for students. And we'll talk through some of the shared responsibilities for those statewide organizations in supporting the system. When we talk about the overall education ecosystem, there's a lot of complexity to this work, which we expect to discuss at length today. Within the proposed 5 districts, we recognize that that's pulling together some districts that are currently operating districts and some districts that are non-operating districts. Within this proposal, the 5 districts are operating districts. And so operating districts that currently exist within the state of Vermont already define attendance zones, and students would attend the public school closest to them. This is applying that same concept within the 5 district model. Within that, we would also honor the state of Vermont's tradition of tuitioning to independent schools. The way that we do that looks very different in this model. And so as we know, there have been parts of our state where we have depended on independent schools to provide education for grades 9 through 12. And so that's something that would continue to be part of the system. And then we also know that there are some parts of our state where we have a lot of high schools that are in close proximity. And it might make sense for one of those public high schools to have a specific specialization. And we know we have some of those examples throughout Vermont with magnet schools. And so the idea within this whole framework is that there is shared accountability for educational outcomes and also financial solvency throughout the system. So our current context, we've talked about this in previous presentations. We know that our current system is highly complex. We have about an average of 1 school board member for every 75 students in the state of Vermont. So it's a very complex structure to oversee a relatively small number of students compared to other states and compared to other districts in other states. We also tend to have a top-heavy organizational structure that creates some redundancy in terms of leadership roles and also limits the ability for us to be able to bring in specialized resources and expertise that can support schools. Oftentimes, the expertise is not placed at the right level of the state education system. And so the governance model is designed to create really to strengthen the overall system and ensuring that we have the right expertise supporting schools. Currently, we have hyper local budgeting decisions, and that often will distance the voter from how that impacts their taxes. We have variability in education standards, which can create some inconsistent expectations and also performance outcomes. Over the last 20 years, we've seen a significant decline in enrollment. It's been over a 21% decline. At the same time, there have been rising costs and larger affordability issues, which are placing considerable strains on our school budgets. Those pressures are resulting in schools having to continue to cut more services for students. And we're seeing this happen most profoundly in our higher needs communities. So part of the sense of urgency to act was to really deliver on Vermont's commitment to equity and ensuring that students that have similar needs receive similar services, and the students that need more support get that support. The lack of scale in our system can create some competition for funding and programs, and the tension between career tech centers and independent schools and programs. When you simply have a smaller number of students, you can't offer the range of programming. And what we heard very clearly from our students when we engaged with them in the Listen and Learn for was they want access to a variety of courses. They want access to electives and extracurriculars. And sometimes the way that we're structured and our scale, we're not able to deliver on those goals for students. As a state, we have a preference for small schools and small classes that can constrain our program offerings and also the ability to hire specialized instructors. So this has very tangible impacts on the system. It creates an education system that's very fragile. Many of the districts have struggled to fill critical positions and to provide operational continuity. We know that there's a high cost of operating the number of schools in our portfolio, and that can divert dollars away from where they're needed most, which is in the classroom. The lack of scale does limit opportunities. It also makes us vulnerable to shifts in federal funding and state economic changes. So part of the intent of this proposal is to really future-proof Vermont's education system. Being one of the top spenders in education, we have an opportunity to be smarter with how we're investing our dollars and centering those in areas that are going to be most impactful for our students and most supportive of our teachers. Overall, we see that our current system has a lot of inequity. And when we're talking about that, we're really centering that evaluation around what students can access in terms of educational opportunities. And we've heard very clearly a call from the Listen and Learn for and all of our planning to focus on equity and making sure that students across the state can take advantage of the same educational opportunities.
You violate my rule. I'm so.
We're all like,
But
chair
when you're
privilege.
talking about equity, you're really here in that bullet, the fifth bullet, fourth bullet, you're really that's really about scale.
That's about scale.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And by the way, I was about to say,
Yeah.
when you finish this one, then I was gonna say if this question so far.
We can stop.
That's-
So we've talked a lot so far about the funding model. And we've said, this is a generous funding amount. We're still with this funding proposal going to be one of the top education spenders in the country. To be able to deliver on what we're describing in that funding model, we have to change our scale. Because if we don't change our scale, it would cost significantly more to be able to do all the things we're trying to prioritize, like expanding early childhood education, expanding college and career technical education, after school electives. The current scale is very challenging to do that, and it would not be possible even with the funding we provided. It would cost more to do that unless we shift our scale.
So now we can take a break. Any questions today? Think about whether your question is like to be answered as we go. forward.
Yes.
Okay.
I thought about that. I have been a chair and I know how. I wanted to give you an opportunity before we move on to say what's working about the system. Like we're going to go back to our communities and they're going to want to make sure we talk about what's good. And I know often just when we are trying to solve a problem, we just lose track of that, but you've now done these sessions, and before we go to how we fix it, like there's some good in one person for every 75 kids wanting to be taking all their evenings up to spend talking about education. So how do we make sure we stop and talk about what's good?
Good job for them.
So, this work, and Jill and I didn't share this, is very personal. We have kids that are in our public schools. I was excited to come to Vermont. I have been continually encouraged by the level of engagement and investment on education. You don't have that in every state. And I think that is a profound asset that we have in the state of Vermont. We also know that our educators are going above and beyond. As we're having conversations with teachers across the state, they're describing ways in which they're supporting students that go beyond what you would think of as their traditional role as teachers. And as they're describing those, they're also describing the challenge of being able to sustain that because they often don't have the support by a mental health professional or the special ed expert to help them in navigating some of those challenges. So I think we have incredible talent. We have an incredible, I think education is part of the ethos of Vermont. We believe in it so strongly.
We're the state of John Dewey.
Yeah, exactly. The debt due to future generations, right? I mean, that's so we also see that there is a lot of innovation and there's great practices in every school. Part of what we're looking to do with this revised framework is helping to really identify those best practices, be able to share them across the state so that we can build upon that innovation. Right now, some of that's the role of the agency as we're, situated in a place where we have that statewide view and we can see the data and we have those conversations. So we're actively designing ways in which we can facilitate that type of planning to bubble up a lot of the really good work and the innovation. So I think it is important to point out the good that's happening in our system, and the changes that we're proposing are really trying to amplify that and to better support our educators in doing that across the state.
Senator Weeks.
So I'll wait.
Okay. Oh, okay.
And if I can add as well, and so you can speak to this from your personal experience with the area where your kids go to school as well, is I think that there is a real concern and even a fear that by changing the district governance scale, that there's going to be a loss of a sort of a sense of community. And our intention, and hopefully you'll see this as we work our way through, is we were really intentional about a couple of things. One is many of our schools have a really wonderful and unique character, and we want to preserve that and preserve the things that Vermonters value in their education system. And we actually are operating from a theory of action that by lifting some of the pressure off of what we're asking schools in very small districts to do, it actually allows for more creativity. And as a former educator myself, and I miss the classroom a lot, I've often said I cannot really imagine what it would be like to be an early career educator right now in our system, because not just because of the pressures of mental health and pressures that kind of students and families are facing, but what we are asking them to do in terms of, and districts, small districts, in terms of developing curriculum on their own, developing, and understanding proficiency-based learning skills on their own. We really are taking away from a lot of the reason that people get into this field, which is teaching and learning. And we're really draining resources away from that focus. So we are really intentional about being supportive of that. And I think the other thing that we really kind of want to, as Zoe was sort of pointing out, is we actually have schools that are doing, and districts that are doing some really great things. And it's like it stops at the border of the district. Right. And they collaborate and they work together, but they're entirely separate systems. And I do think that we need to sort of have this acknowledgement that some systems are doing really well. And literally the school next door, those kids may be having a fundamentally different experience. And that's not the fault of the people in the building. That is a result of the system that we have created. It is actually yielding the outcome that our system is sort of designed to sort of create. And so that's something that we really are intentionally trying to tackle. And we've tried to be really specific and clear and explicit about what our goals were. And that as we worked our way through this plan, we were measuring whether or not our different ideas, and there was a lot of them, we're going to achieve those goals. And that's how we arrived at this. And so we're trying to be really explicit about that. Other people could identify different goals and it would yield a different system. But these were the goals that we identified.
So we'll move into the district governance proposal. And as you've articulated, we started this work with identifying our goals and then developing the approach to achieve those goals. The goal is to achieve scale. In doing that, we'll reduce the administrative burden, but actually will increase opportunities for educational leadership that go beyond more of the kind of the compliance and oversight, and are thinking about educational leadership in areas like curriculum, like professional development, in areas that we know are going to really help to support and strengthen the system in being innovative and building upon what is working very well. The other goal is to expand access to these specialized services. Our larger districts are able to bring in additional resources. And so this is intended to guarantee that districts have the funding, the resources to hire experts in key areas, and the superintendent now has more access to draw from, or they can draw from more experts and resources to support the system. By nature of creating larger regions, it allows us to be more equitable. As we just described, when you're doing really hyper local decision making, you may be able to make decisions that are really great for that group of 300 students, but the town over might have a very different experience, but they might have a much higher need. And so when we think about equity, it really is about investing more in areas that need the resources more. And you can do that more effectively with a larger scale so that decision making is taking into account the different needs of communities and aligning resources accordingly. There was also an explicit goal with this approach to achieve similar taxpayer capacity, so that districts have some more similar property tax wealth. That's important as we think about funding the overall system. Moving from our current structure to this structure gets us there considerably. So I think in our current structure is about 11 times difference when you think about property wealth, and moving to the 5 regions, this gets us to about 2 times difference. And that would be something we can kind of walk through as we go through the slides, but that's really important from a funding perspective and making sure there's equity from the taxpayer.
Is that important as it relates to the foundation, or is it related, does it become important only if we're talking about with districts to raise extra dollars?
It certainly becomes more important and critical when you're thinking about the policy decision around raising local dollars.
Okay.
So as I mentioned, this 5-district model does eliminate the supervisory union structure, moves us to 5 regional districts. Each of these districts would be governed by an elected school board. Each of these districts would have a robust central office staff. We did note in the report that there are special considerations related to interstate districts. There actually is a lot of additional work that would need to be done in addressing interstate districts. Maybe going so far as an act of Congress to change those interstate districts. So there is some more work in that area. Also, in very remote parts of our state, we may need to think about some exceptions in terms of being able to have some out-of-state tuition. But the model here really is focused on investing dollars within Vermont schools. So
So you're thinking about the interstate, you're thinking mostly, is that the Hanover?
There are 2 interstate districts, and so it's Rivendell and
It's
SAU 70.
also known as Norwich.
Yeah.
Norwich, and that's the Norwich, Hanover, right? The kids go to the Hanover High School.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a very small number of students that are in those interstate districts. So that's another point to make here as we design this approach, is thinking comprehensively around designing a statewide system. We know that in doing that, we're building it on top of a system that's existed for hundreds of years. And so there will likely be exceptions that need to be looked at, but we didn't build the plan around the exceptions. We built the plan to design the great statewide public education system. And we recognize, and then we're calling out where there are some special considerations that we will need to take into account, particularly during the transition period.
I just want to make sure I fully understand this, because earlier I wrote down no out-of-state dollars.
Correct. So our current practice now with
Yeah.
non-operating districts, so in this model,
Right.
all districts are operating districts.
Yeah.
And so there would not be the option to send those dollars out of
Mhm.
state or to a different country for
Yes.
a child to be educated. We're just calling out that as we make this transition and we're looking at the maps, there might be very few exceptions around the border
of border issues.
Yeah,
Border
so
issue.
for
It
example,
would be regional. It would be
Okay.
more for our border
Okay.
states where there would be some
Okay.
exceptions that we may need to consider.
Mhm.
And we're just
Okay.
calling that out. But as we go into the maps and we
Enroll-
start to really think about
Yeah.
attendance zones,
Yeah.
those are outliers in this
Right.
conversation.
Right.
And we're just calling that out because practically speaking, this plan
Yeah.
has to work. And
Right.
so we're just in very remote areas, there may be. some-
Just recognizing that we're gonna have to tweak here and there.
Like the
Yeah.
Granville scenario.
also-
Yeah, and you can see in the maps that
Yeah.
will.
when you look at the maps, so,
Okay.
yeah, these are at the end of the report that we
Okay.
published,
Yeah.
and you can see, when you're looking up in the Northeast Kingdom, there are certain parts of the Northeast Kingdom that genuinely do not have a school independent or
Right.
public,
Right.
but there's students that live right on the border and there may be a school.
Yeah.
So we want a practical, workable system, but
Yes.
as Zoe said, you don't build a statewide system around the exceptions.
Right.
You address the exceptions through your statewide system.
Mhm.
So we'll come to that. Okay.
So this is a map that I think we've shared a couple times. On the left, you see our current system. Moving towards the right is the 5 district model. It's also relevant to note that this is a longstanding structure with the regional superintendent's organization, so has served as a 4-on-4 education planning. Go ahead.
So on these maps, I've had voiced concerns from the Champlain Valley region that, they're almost triple what the others are.
Mhm.
And the other biggest concern I'm getting from up in Franklin County and down in my county is like the method, the mindset, the culture, the educational difference between how Burlington, South Burlington, Colchester run their schools and say Addison or Franklin do. So how do we address that what they're worried of is that you're going to have Burlington, South Burlington dictating what's happening up in the north and down in the south.
So we'll address that. And we know we've heard that as a question as well. So we're, open to having a conversation around, what's the right organization, but in doing that, we want to make sure we're clear on the goals. And so part of this table is elucidating the rationale for these boundaries. We think that as part of the plan and focusing on equity, there should be some consistency in terms of needs of these communities. And you can see that when we're looking at the broader region, there's a lot more similarity in terms of students that receive or qualify for free reduced lunch, English learners, and also the property wealth. Another piece of that within the size of the districts is those would also have different resources at their central office to be able to provide support. Each of the districts would have attendance zones within them where you're really able to identify those key feeding patterns from elementary, middle to high. So it's not a monolith, right? There's going to be variation within district around what type of programs schools may offer or what type of wraparound supports they may provide. But the idea of having it within a broader region is you're actually able to pool resources more effectively and at the district level make those decisions around how you would differentiate. Additionally, within the school board representation, we're suggesting that there's representation from different communities within the district. So there will be voting warrants drawn to ensure that there is that representation when school board members are making decisions that are impacting the entire district.
I hear you. It just that there is such a concentration in Burlington and that's I think we're just going to run into trouble. We just have so many more people tonight. That means they're going to have more people at the table, and that the southern half and the northern half are going to be really worried about being heard. I don't know if that's going to happen down in the southwest region, but I know I've had constituents really voice that, hey, that we're triple the size and we're really worried that. So as long as you're taking that into account as you're going forward and can say guardrails, as you call them, to reassure our constituents that they're not going to be overran by one or the other.
Yeah, representation is really important with this model and also thinking about how to organize the school boards. So as you've noted, the Champlain Valley region is larger, and in the report, we identified that it may be valuable to add additional school board members for that district. so that you actually have more than 5 voting districts. You might have 7 voting districts, and those would be organized to make sure that they're representative of what you're describing as kind of the different community needs or priorities. And part of this work in every region will be shifting from thinking about the shared responsibility of a larger group of communities. That will also be part of a culture shift, I think, as we're talking about decision making at this level. But we do think representation is really important.
Well, I mean, you know, this is up to the chair to address fully, and I just know that at some point this becomes a government operations conversation. Especially if you're talking about wards and how people vote and how representative it is and districts, you know, and I mean, there's not a lot of people left in the building who were there for the last 2 redistrictings, but it's almost has to be a parallel conversation right now, like outside of our committee or side.
Well, I'm assuming we'll do some thinking about this.
Yes, yeah.
And then.
Send it to GovOps. Okay.
Just touch on the right-hand column a little bit. The grand list for opportunity. Just talk about what those numbers actually mean in the first instance, and then how they relate.
So as we've described it, there's some thought to ensuring that there are similarity in terms of property wealth, and that being important to comply with the Brigham decision should there be a policy choice to raise additional local revenue. And so you can see that there's a greater similarity here, and the tax department would probably be the best to address the specific questions around equalization. But it's an easier problem to fix because of the similarity in property wealth.
So does it mean does it mean taking the Champlain Valley region that there's $1.2 billion in property wealth for every student? So what that means?
It's an overall evaluation. I think it's the average. I'd have them come in and look at it. I think for our purposes in education, it was just ensuring that should that policy decisions made, how we're mindful of creating equity. And the tax department, I think, would be better served and positioned to answer that question. But we're just from an education standpoint calling out that is a factor as you think about this overall.
And just to point out, I think you said earlier that the 2-to-1 is the Northeast region versus the Southeast region.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Can I ask one more question about that? Someone said these were already how the cooperative spending models were built. I'm not saying both these. Sometimes I just can't go with certain terms. But these cooperative spending models, did they think about this property wealth ratio when they created those spending co-ops?
No,
I think
it's
those are
not
the same.
spending. Yeah.
These are the regional superintendents organizational structure.
Okay.
And so as we actually did our listen and learn planning, one of the first questions we had is how do we think about the regions? And so we used these regions as a default.
Yeah.
Actually not intending for these to be a part of the proposal.
Okay.
But then as we can walk through it, it didn't meet a lot of the goals in terms of being able to deliver at the scale that we thought was important. Like what you're referring to are the boards of cooperative education services.
Well, I guess I'm not. Because I'm just wondering if you used an existing framework or boundary line, did they have the property wealth in mind?
They were irrespective of property. It was really more toward organizing for education leaders to come together and share what was happening within their region. Through our listen and learn tour, we actually started to develop a regional profile. And we asked them to identify what's really unique about your region. What are some of the trends as we think about industry and housing and school identity? And as you get broader regions, there's a lot of different, I think, assets that come forward in terms of the types of community partnerships that are available in the districts, the unique identities. All of those are important as you think about, one, you want to create cohesion, right, across the district, but you also want to celebrate unique differences across communities. And so that balance would be important to this process.
But you did not attempt to cut that district in half and find problems doing that.
Do you mean
Oh,
the
you're talking about
Champlain
Champlain Valley
Valley
specific?
District?
Yeah, I think,
I
oh,
think-
sorry, yeah.
Yeah, so I think we wanna, again, like, we had sort of some clearly defined goals.
Yeah,
Right, and so, it's not the first person to ask this question, right? So if you have the goals and the intent in mind that we just described,
hmm
I think the question very quickly becomes, well, how would you cut that district in half and
Yeah.
still achieve those goals, right? If you wanted to continue to have what we have in the third column, which is a pretty, we really start to even out like the free and reduced lunch. So the needs of the districts really start to look really similar. Right now, there's a pretty wide span. Some of our districts are about 8% FRL and some are well above 60%.
right,
So any way that you might consider dividing up that region, I think everyone should be starting from what is our explicit goals that we're trying to achieve.
right.
Do we still maintain it?
Okay, so let's say we were trying to do the property, this last column. You didn't.
That was
see
not
it.
the determining factor.
Okay,
That was
no.
not a determining factor. So
Oh.
I do think it's important for us as we're talking from the educational context. It's
Yes.
really about educational quality and scale.
uh-huh,
As we did different modeling, we also worked with the tax department to understand those implications. And it turns out
Okay.
that this model and this particular configuration gets us closer to that parity.
interesting. Okay,
From an educational perspective, this structure keeps existing districts whole. So the lines don't cut across. Right now, an elementary school that feeds into a middle school that feeds into a high school.
Mhm.
So from an education view, you're already starting with your districts in their current operational structure. And that's, I think, a really helpful place to start when we move on to the next part, which is thinking about these districts are operating districts, right? So there are attendance zones as part of that are already building.
We should keep going. We're
Yeah.
time is half
So,
gone.
oh, sorry.
We're
So,
obviously gonna talk about
yeah,
it.
so
We're obviously gonna spend time. on this.
I'll breeze through, but the scale piece is really important as we think about the central office. So the central office in this model looks very different than our current central office because you're able to bring in additional resources. We're using the evidence-based approach, and they have outlined ratios based on staffing per students. Within this framework, we would actually we're recommending more of a school size that's larger than the 3,900 in the base model, which would allow districts to have even more resources. This was important because we've heard consistently from educators that they were lacking the support and that they needed more specialized resources. And so that was an intentional part of this design. Next week, we'll be able to bring in some additional modeling around what these districts could look like. With this funding formula, we have built it to guarantee that this amount provides a great education, and we've itemized what that is. But there's flexibility for the district to make local decisions. So we'll model for you what that looks like, and there's some decisions at the district level that they could make to best meet the needs of their schools and students. So we've talked already, I think, a lot about the school boards and representation being very important. So this is where we talk about voting districts. That is a parallel process that is happening. So that would not be something that the Agency of Education would be recommending in terms of voting districts. So the Secretary of State's office is involved in that part of the process. So far, we've talked a lot about the scale and thinking about the scale from decision-making for school boards, the scale we could achieve for resources at the central office. We also want to make sure that there's a high level of engagement at the school level. So this plan would require every school to have a school advisory committee. That committee would have representation from students, staff, parents and caregivers, community partners, and they have a very important and specific role. And we like to make a distinction between the school advisory councils and a PTA or parent teacher association. Parent teacher associations tend to organize events and do fundraising. The school advisory committees are focused on more of recommendations on the strategic direction for the school. So they would be providing input on the school improvement plan, which is a state and federal requirement. They would also be an important component of our proposed equitable budgeting process, where there would actually be a set aside within the school budget for the advisory committee to provide input on how that should be spent to best meet the needs of the students. Organically, school advisory councils may decide to kind of form regional school advisory councils to the extent they want to share ideas around what's happening for students in elementary, middle, and high school.
And so, Senator, to your question about, we do have a part of that commitment within Vermont to education, I think is expressed in the really large number of school board members that we have, right? And so I was sort of jokingly said, like, we have a job for them. And one of the things that we've really been thinking about, again, one of our kind of key principles is actually how do you maintain and even increase, because this is something that we heard really strongly in the listen and learn from both educators and education leaders and from community members and parents, is they're feeling like they are not as connected to each other as they would like it to be, right? That family engagement, community engagement. And so one piece of the sort of school advisory committees, which is a model in other states as well, is we thought about what are the ways right now that people engage with the sort of strategic vision and planning for their local school. And while we do have the school boards, we're doing a lot of great work in our volunteer and our meeting, once a month. And what we do sort of recognize is that a lot of times the only place where people actually engage with this is on town meeting day, when they're voting on a percent up or percent down or a number. Right. And by creating school advisory committees, but also switching to a foundation formula, the engagement is actually much deeper on the things that actually matter to student outcomes, to the culture of a school and a community, and kind of how that school fits into the larger community as well. So that was a really explicit intent that we had. If folks have more questions, so he's actually sat on one of these, so she can kind of speak to that experience. But it really is sort of a fundamentally different way of engaging with the school than the way that happens now, which oftentimes only is about 12% of our voters.
Okay, move into the proposal for the overall education ecosystem. And we know, I want to acknowledge that just the term school choice brings up a lot of questions and feelings. And so I think it's really important as we go through this plan that we're really clear around what we mean as we're walking through this proposal. This proposal is about strengthening our public education system. It looks different than how we currently administer education. So in this proposal, there would be no non-operating districts. There would be no setting of average tuition. The amount of the base and weight funding would be the same across public and approved school choice schools. In this model as an operating district, similar to how we have now, there would be attendance zones drawn so that every student across the state would be assigned to a public school. And that's currently how it happens in most places across our states.
All right. I'm actually really confused because I am not in the holy war about this issue. So I actually don't know what you mean by a school choice school.
Yeah.
Okay, because is that not any school? That's a specific school you're talking about?
Yeah.
Right, that's school?
So in the how we label this, I think will change, right?
Yeah.
So this current construct doesn't exactly exist, and this construct does not exist.
Okay.
In our current framework.
Okay.
So what we're proposing is that the idea here is that you have a strong public school that is resourced well to provide a range of educational programming, and every student, because of where they live, has access to that and closest to them. They would be assigned. We also know that a healthy system provides some options for students that might meet their interests. If they're very interested in engineering, for example, maybe there's a specialized program.
Like a magnet school.
So
Yeah,
within
in other states, it would be a magnet.
Okay.
So within, yes, and in Vermont's tradition, there has been in parts of our state a real reliance on independent schools to provide education in grades 9 through 12. And
Right.
this proposal honors that. And those independent schools would apply to be a school of choice. If a public school would be interested, they would apply to be a school of choice.
Okay. So
And
for example, like Burlington, right?
Yes, you have
put
two
the-
magnet
You have
programs.
magnet.
You have two magnet.
Yes, so we have 2 magnet programs and now any student in Burlington, I believe, can go to any school in
Assuming
Burlington.
there's space,
Right,
right? So that's the key part of this overall model is you
Okay.
need to make sure that as a state, we're guaranteeing access to a high quality public education and allowing for students to exercise options should there be space available, and to honor the tradition of many of our historic academies. That process of a lottery would also give preferences or could give preferences to where you live, and there could also be preferences for siblings. So choice schools would not have a boundary, an attendance zone. They would be open to students applying. And if there are spots available, they would be able to attend. If there weren't spots available, they have access to a great public school. So it's that system. that we're
How does this actually going to work with regard to independent schools?
How does what?
How is this actually going to work with regard to independent schools? Where you have, well, we have 2 sets, right? We have the traditional academies, and then we have the smaller independents. How would kids end up being able to go to one of the smaller independents?
So the process for applying to be a school of choice is similar in the process that exists now, where an independent school would need to be approved to receive public tuition. Part of what we would also build into
They are approved to receive.
in this model, all choice schools would need to go through the process to be approved.
And there'd be eligibility criteria that would be shared by independent schools and public schools.
Correct.
And the state would set those criteria. And then the school would apply through the district to be a school choice.
Okay, so if one of these smaller independents somewhere, how is it determined which kids can go there?
So once a school is approved as a school choice school, any child within the district could apply
Okay,
to that school.
so that's how it would work with the, let's just say a smaller. So you go to the academies where they have both St. J, LI, Bedford, and Longwood all have relationships going back a couple hundred years with some towns.
Yeah.
Kids from Weston have come to Bremer for 200 years.
Right.
They don't have to, but they can. Will there be kids from Weston? Could there be kids from Weston who can't come?
So as part of the one application process, the school would define their lottery preferences. And so if there's been, as you're describing, as an historic relationship with towns, there could be a preference in the lottery for those students because of where they live. And assuming spots are available, those students would be able to attend that school.
Okay, so it's okay. I think I understand what you're saying. Yeah, those will take more exploration, but I understand what you're saying. So I don't know which one of you was first. So you're gonna ask the
Rock,
question.
paper, scissors.
Your turn.
Yeah. The application to go to a school choice school, is that the lottery process?
Yeah.
Or is that,
Yeah.
is there another?
That's the lottery.
process.
Who enters the lottery? Still,
Students that would live in the district. So there's 2
Okay.
parts of this process. Is one, identifying those schools that have been approved as school choice schools. And that would go through a process with the district. As part of that, you want to clarify what spots are, number of student seats or student stations would be available for a school choice school. The intention about this is to really build a strong education ecosystem so that we have high quality public schools that every student can access with educational options that are aligned to their interest. For those may not appeal to every student.
I mean, I imagine we're gonna maybe spend a whole day on this, or I don't know if I can.
It's a big topic.
It's a big topic, and I guess I'm trying to understand a scenario in which someone might put their child into a lottery and then they don't get accepted. Could they then pay for their child to go to that school?
Yeah, so none of what we're describing changes how an independent school can accept private tuition. All we're
Okay.
describing is how are we going to build a really high quality public education system that has guardrails and accountability to
Mhm.
ensuring that public dollars are spent in a way that's going to really ensure academic and financial solvency.
So,
So being the district, if you have a person that applies and wins the lottery and they live in Alberg and they're gonna go to Middlebury because that's where their kid wanted to go, how we, is it gonna be the parents' responsibility to get them there? As far as transportation?
So all of those questions are policy choices. So what we've talked about within the foundation formula is we have added additional assumptions around transportation. Currently, transportation is not required for public schools across the state.
Okay, great.
And so we've heard that that's an equity consideration. And as we think about policy decisions around transportation, that's part of the reason we increased the amount. I will say that kind of what we've called kind of a blunt estimate right now. There would need to be a lot more modeling done to actually understand what the cost would be if transportation were a guarantee for both your local public school and choice school. There would likely be some transportation boundaries we need to think through. There's some complexity there, but that is a policy question around whether or not the state determines to provide transportation, which we do not require now.
And I think that's, you're keying in on something. There's things that the state is going to agree is sort of reasonable to support through the funding system. And then there may be choices the district makes with its allocation of dollars that may,
Yes.
They might decide that they really want to prioritize, that they're driving kids all over their district. They might decide to prioritize other things, but that's going to be their sort of, this is how much money you're going to get. So we are always trying to peel off, like, what are the decisions that the state is making and prioritizing? And then what is the flexibility and decisions that the district might make?
All the way down to the parent, actually.
All the way down to the parent. That's right.
so one more question about the smaller independents. Wouldn't there be a financial incentive for the district to deny any of these smaller independents getting the status because the dollars we go to that school rather than, getting by, we have a handful of the smaller independents in my view are literally saving kids. And if you're in this model and the district is making the decisions about which schools can become certified to be a choice school, wouldn't the district have any inclination to not have any of those schools be certified?
I don't know that I'd want to speculate on that. I think the key piece is that this model is assuming shared accountability, and there would be very clear criteria as part of that application process around the school being able to meet that. I also think this is part of a broader conversation. We're talking about accountability within independent schools and choice schools, and also within our public schools. And the point of the whole work that we're doing here is to strengthen our public education system, make sure that every school that receives public dollars is able to deliver on high quality educational programming that will be defining through education policy, and also that they're financially solvent. So I think as we've flagged, there are some public schools also that may not meet that standard. There are some independent schools that may not meet that standard. So again, this whole work is around raising the standards, raising the expectations, and making sure that public dollars are really invested in ways that are strengthening schools and providing
My
options.
question was a little bit different than that, but that's okay. We'll leave it. We're going to spend time on this, so we need to move on.
Okay.
Just to make sure you get your time to get through things.
Okay, so part of the exploration here is we've talked about the resources that are needed at the school level. Talked about the scale that's needed within the regions and the central offices. We've noted that within the central offices, there'll be more access to expertise and additional staff resources. But we also think within the system, there will likely need to be specialized services. We've called out areas like special education and career and technical education, where we think there would be value in establishing education service agencies. And I'll allow Jill to kind of expand on how we're thinking about designing those in a way that's going to be aligned with this overall system.
Sure. So we're using the term education service agencies. In the state recently, we've been talking about BOCES. the education service agency is an umbrella term. So we're trying to kind of think a little bit more broadly. So we do have Act 168 that was already passed, and we are, sort of really considering that there would likely need to be sort of a revisiting and maybe amendments to that, because it was built to address a need within the current system. And so we're sort of contemplating how might an education service agency or a BOCES operate within this new structure. And so these are just some principles. And as Secretary Saunders has already pointed out, we've been thinking about those areas where this kind of structure might actually be able to strengthen the system. Again, it's all about strengthening the system itself at every level. So these are just some kind of key principles for us to think about as we're contemplating this. So the first is any education service agency should be aimed at building capacity in the education system to deliver on key services and support that cannot otherwise be met by districts or the AOE. So Act 168 was an acknowledgement that our small scale districts were not able to deliver on kind of regional services, right? Or services that could be more effectively delivered regionally. We should contemplate what that looks like if we're at a 5-district scale. So what are those key services? In addition, these entities should be increasing coherence across the system. That's really critical. We shouldn't be adding complexity, and we shouldn't be creating misalignment between the agency, the districts, and this in-between entity. They really need to be, we need to think about the relationship between the agency and these entities. So in the current construct, it's sort of the districts that organize together to form one. We may need to sort of revisit that idea, because maybe it actually needs to be something where there's a stronger relationship with the agency. Things to contemplate. The third is that these entities should be increasing equity through the consistent delivery of high quality services and support in a small rural state, meaning that all students are going to benefit from this. All educators might benefit from these supports. So really the goal is to increase that equity. I think our sort of current Act 168 has that as an explicit goal. And then it's important that whatever activities that these entities are sort of engaged in, that they're really aligned with statewide or cross-district approaches, and that they yield specific and measurable results. So I think what we're saying is we need to do some more thinking collectively around how we might leverage this kind of either a statewide or inter-district or kind of regional construct to, again, strengthen the overall system. But we want to be cautious about creating more complexity, where we're trying really hard to reduce the amount of complexity. And again, like coherence bringing is like a really important goal that Zoe and I share. We actually have a very fractured system. So we want to make sure that this is actually serving that purpose.
So I'm sitting here wondering, we did BOCES because we have little tiny districts and trying to get a few of them together. Wouldn't this just be done at the district level?
So
Potentially.
It's something we wouldn't even have to deal with.
that's part of what we're exploring now, and that gets into the next part of governance, which is thinking about the roles and responsibilities of the Agency of Education and the state board. So within the Agency of Education, we'll be able to provide leadership, oversight, and support. There may be certain areas where the agency doesn't have the capacity to provide the level of on the ground support, and that's where we're thinking the education services agencies could play a role. Again, though, I think all of that needs to be designed with intention. We don't want to create overlap and duplication, but there is something to be said within our system. Scale is going to be challenging for us as a state. So even getting to the regional model, it gets us to a level of scale. But in terms of maybe highly specialized services and resources, we may need to share that across the state. And that's where education service agencies could be of support. So an example on why special education has been contemplated is we know that we have a challenge in recruiting certified special educators. And so does it make more sense to have that within kind of a statewide support infrastructure or embedded within the regions? These are decisions also that would be made in partnership with the new districts. Because there's a lot of flexibility within the funding at the district level and how to resource. They may choose, instead of hiring staff, to contract that out to an education service agency. So we're contemplating having these available, but obviously those are partnership decisions with the district.
So I think the next, I'm just gonna, just in the interest of
Yeah.
time. Yeah, I think, slide 21 and 22, you've seen this before. It's a little bit of a recap. It's just kind of the current roles and responsibilities of the agency and the state board.
So really, as we look at that, there's shared responsibility, for between the agency of education and the state board. And part of the education transformation is really being intentional around how to leverage the expertise of both entities to support and strengthen the overall system. I think as we look at the different responsibilities currently delineated, we see that there is an overlap. That overlap has occurred during the transition from the department becoming an agency. And so this is an opportunity for us to really clarify those roles and ensure that the scope of that work is well defined and that we can work synergistically to support the overall needs of the system. We believe that there are certain roles that make sense for a state board to oversee, and there are certain roles for the agency to oversee. And we have attempted to map those out, and we know there'll be further conversations around that. So the agency of education, which slide did you think we should go to? Is
I think we should go to 24.
that where I am?
Yes.
So as we talk about the agency, we are responsible for the oversight of federal and state laws and federally mandated activities, including around special education and career and technical education. We've mentioned that there is some overlap currently as it relates to areas such as visioning, goal setting, and the evaluation of overall education quality in the system. So the goal for this is so the goal for this is really for the agency to retain its current responsibilities, but have new responsibilities through rulemaking. The intent of that is really a practical consideration and also an intention to ensure strong implementation between the rules and the oversight that the agency provides, having that housed under one agency, and that being our primary role in both support and strengthening the field and ensuring high quality implementation of protocols related to finance, governance, education quality, and the overall wellness of our system. Related to the State Board of Education within this transition to the new districts, we think there's a role in supporting the new school boards. And so they outline some areas of the district quality standards where we think would be really helpful for the state board to oversee and providing the resources, training, and support for those boards to really look at student-centered governance. Also, the roles related to the approval of school choice schools, they would have a part of that process as they currently do related to the appeals. And then there's specific sections that we've called out of the district quality that we think would be really helpful in being able to place within the state board, particularly around the equity budget model, and also developing and maintaining model policies. Formal presentation, and we can open it up for questions.
Plenty of go.
So
Yes.
I just, that, it's like when we look at your proposed districts, we should be looking at it as a totally new education system. The way you came up with your numbers is by child, and this is what it's gonna take for your formula to be the most effective.
yes.
And not just the formula, but the quality, right?
Quality.
Three-legged stool.
Yeah.
So it's, we're always coming at this from the perspective of how do we achieve education quality? And that really has to do with delivery of education as well. So not just the formula. The formula is built for this system, but also we are contemplating in our proposal some changes in how education is delivered to be more effective and equitable across the state.
It's the formula is built with educational priorities in mind and
Yeah.
assumptions around what we can deliver with that funding. and at what scale. So these regions are proposed and are aligned to what we believe can be achievable with the funding proposed and at that level of quality that we would expect.
I know you're ready to go.
Waiting patiently.
Yeah, quiet for an hour. So the 5 district model has been out there for a couple of weeks. So we've been receiving some criticism from constituents. One of the criticisms, which I think needs to be aired out, is we seem to have now backed into justifying the 5 district model. And I'm wondering if there was a thought put into if there were other models that had been reviewed that may have developed a different number of districts with a different criteria, whether it's students, number of schools, which means advisory councils or advisory committees. How did you find the sweet spot? We really have to start offering some justification to our constituents on how you were on.
Yeah. So it's evident that there's a lot of different ways to slice and dice this, right? And to think about different ways to draw the lines. I think it's really important to center that conversation around what we're trying to achieve. And within this construct, we are trying to optimize our system to ensure that dollars can be placed in areas that are going to have the biggest impact for our kids. And so with the scale, that allows us to increase teacher salaries. It allows us to have additional resources available to the superintendent to support their principal, to support their teachers. So any adjustments would adjust the modeling around what would be available in terms of our ability to deliver on those goals that we've identified. So I think next week would be helpful. We're going to bring in some examples around how you go about budgeting, because it's also a different way to think about budgeting and resourcing our system. We are working with some of the money committees and looking side by side, but it's really important. It's really not a side by side comparison. The resources are at different levels where they're needed the most. So instead of maybe housing a resource within the school, that might be at the district level now. And so the overall way that we budget is different, with the intention of being able to maximize our resources effectively to deliver on what we heard was most important, which was getting services to students and supporting our teachers and doing more, right? We've talked about they're doing more than just providing, instruction. They're doing a lot of the wraparound support. This enables us for resources and ways to support that.
Okay, so if I can follow up, and just throw a little bit one question. So districts will deal with principals. Principals deal with schools and students. What's the optimal number for the number of schools in a district would have responsibility over? It's a different perspective, but it's got to be something that's somewhere in this process had to be looked at. That okay, that number, whether it's Champlain Valley or what have you, that number's okay. We're comfortable. Like, another column with numbers of schools would be like a good start to kind of show, okay, so we're looking at these criteria, but here's another one with, here's the number of principals that, float up to the one district superintendent.
So there won't be,
The portfolios in each district
Yeah.
the portfolio of schools in each district will vary depending on enrollment, facilities, geography. It's going to vary. And the model allows for that flexibility. The assumptions built into the funding are also assuming certain class size. They're assuming the ability to deliver certain programs. And so that would be part of the criteria as you think about any conversations around consolidation or getting to the right number of schools. I know I've heard that question. A lot of people are asking, what's the right number of schools, right? Is a lot of the question. This approach is a practical approach. We're setting criteria and assumptions within the funding of what can be delivered. We have made some adjustments in terms of size of schools, but ultimately at a district level, there are different decisions that will be made depending on what the district needs to prioritize in terms of using those dollars in a way that's going to best support their students. And so that might mean in some districts that they maintain smaller schools. It might mean in another district, they decide to consolidate smaller schools and offer more in middle school, right? And these are all decisions within a framework that would be allowable.
And I think the key word there was practical, right? We're not starting from scratch. We're starting from 300 years of an education system. And so it's not practical. Like this was.
We don't want to this should not be overly prescriptive because we are transforming an education system that's been in existence for some time. We are going to build in quality standards to get us there. And there will be a transition. And then there's going to be some areas where it's just practical for that school to be a small school. It may not be practical to build a new facility, or it may not be practical for those students to get on a bus to go to another school because it's over an hour away, right? And so that's why we haven't provided a specific number of schools. There does need to be
starting
practical.
Starting, not the end point. But how many schools right now are in each district? That's just a
I see.
simple, very
So-
simple.
Oh, you want to
starting
know?
metric.
Sorry, I didn't
Not
understand your
finishing.
question. So within a snapshot, what we've provided so far is like the number of students. What you're looking for is, okay, how many elementary, how many middle, how many high?
It's just another look at.
Okay,
Sure. Trying to find.
Yeah,
We
and
can
we
provide that.
provided some, thank you. We have some very pretty maps. Those are all of the schools that currently exist in the districts, both the independent and the public. And we also can very easily provide sort of those schools in each district, the number of students within them. Yes, we have that. Okay.
So not or then back.
So I think and I think you've been kind of touching on this in what you just discussed. I mean, my thoughts are around local governance and, you know, these smaller schools, whether they're practical or not practical, but that is the concern that I have is who is making the decision as to whether or not a school is practical or impractical. And, you know, so for example, I'm looking at the Southeast region and contemplating the, you know, the most populous areas, Springfield, White River Junction, Bellows Falls, Brattleboro, Dover, and school board members getting elected, you know, just by nature of the process, you know, getting elected from those areas because of the population density. And having those be the board members to decide whether or not a school in, let's say, Wardsboro or Weston, I mean, I'm just picking places that are, you know, far, far away from these population centers. I'm just a little concerned as to those board members who may never even have visited those towns, making decisions as to whether or not a school is practical or impractical. And so I'm curious as to what type of guardrails may be contemplated in this process.
That's an excellent point. And guardrails will be important. That's what we've heard on the ground. A lot of districts and superintendents have been contemplating some changes in terms of consolidating and merging. But because there's not a clear criteria, it's really hard to do that at the local level. So as part of this proposal, there do need to be clear criteria and guardrails for how you are defining a school that is small by choice versus a school that is small by necessity. Those are recommendations that we will bring forward, and those are policy decisions. But we are hearing on the ground that type of leadership is needed from the state. Because to your point, if we don't provide that, these decisions will be made in a way that's very subjective. The other piece to that, to the policy consideration is how do we ensure that those changes are resulting in better opportunities for students? So through that planning process, there needs to be a way to clearly communicate if a school is going to close, what will the benefit be to students? Does that give them access to a better facility? Does that give them access to more programming? That needs to be clearly articulated as part of those discussions. And as a state, those parameters would need to be really clear, concrete, transparent, easy to measure.
Senator Weeks. It's very quiet and I was going to consider it. So I'm good.
I'm gonna go way back to the beginning. So the moratorium, current moratorium on independent schools, approved independent schools. Does that include therapeutic schools?
So I think therapeutic schools are part of a different conversation, and we can also talk about, there's been some movement to, for some of our public schools and districts to be organizing to support those needs. And I think we'd like to continue those conversations, and we think there can be definitely value there. When we're talking about the moratorium, I think that has been my understanding, and I need to clarify, is that that was really focused on K-12. And I think it's just a recognition that because of our declining enrollment, we're not looking to add more schools to the portfolio.
It's
Right?
specific though to therapeutic.
Yeah.
This is
Oh,
kind of-
sorry. Yeah, you're right.
This is
You
kind of
are right. It did.
constituents.
There has been some conversation around, I know in kind of broader community around, should there be a carve out for therapeutic schools? I do think that would need to be analyzed as part of our an understanding of our overall delivery of special education. And I would want to bring in some of our special education experts, because when we look at our utilization of separate schools in the state of Vermont, we are outside of the norm compared to other states. So we have more students in therapeutic schools than other states do. And that's something we need to think about as we're being intentional around ensuring every student has an inclusive education environment. So I would want to bring in some other experts to engage in that conversation, because I think it's broader than just talking about schools. It's also talking about how we deliver special education.
Okay, so can I just try to summarize, because
But yes, current moratorium does include therapeutic schools.
good, but is that on the table to be reconsidered as far as removing that moratorium specific to therapeutic schools? That's the question.
That's not part of this proposal.
And I think what Zoe was saying is that any consideration of that should actually bring in our larger conversation about how we deliver special education, because the reliance on therapeutic schools in Vermont is an outlier.
Yes.
And so before it was contemplated to lift that and to create more, we should actually take a step back and have a conversation about how do we actually want to deliver special education in Vermont in a more inclusive way. And the creation of more therapeutic schools would be not
So to
moving
go
in
back
that
to your
direction.
question, is the expectation that that review will be part of this effort? Or is that something which?
Everything is right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that needs to be part of our conversation as we think about special education delivery, and just as you think about the cost of special education delivery, and not being, I think there's an acknowledgement that we and an understanding that we haven't fully met the expectations of the Census Block Grant, which was really not just a funding approach, but was designed to get Vermont in alignment with best practices in terms of how to deliver special education. So we do need to be having those conversations. I think discussions around the potential for an education service agency to be supporting special ed should be contemplating that. So I agree that it's part of the broader discussion. This proposal is not suggesting that we have any sort of a carve out for therapeutic schools with the moratorium. And that's because we believe we need to have a broader discussion around special education delivery and how we're supporting that as a state, because we don't feel like that's solving the current challenge.
You can go around the room. Nobody else.
I don't want you to get penalized for having been patient. So who was
Well,
Taking it all in. Want to get work on
Senator Ross Robinson?
I don't, this is maybe my closing thought for Friday and another day.
Friday?
It is indeed Friday.
Say so.
I've done some equity presentations, mostly around transportation, but I've used the example of Japan. And Japan, I'm looking at Oliver because he's been in committee with me for years and he knows I can go on huge tangents, but Japan after World War II, designed all of their communities around kids being able to walk to school. So they, and little kids, right? Like, I mean, I appreciated early in this whole process, you said, you know, people don't want to give up their local elementary schools. I don't think Vermont is far away from that principle, that we're starting to sound very like widgets and, you know, bells and whistles. And, you know, when I think of what makes me look forward to my kids growing older, it's that we can walk and bike them to the school. And you know, I just don't want to forget the things that we want to give people, not just the things we want to take away or consolidate. You know, if we add more childcare to what the elementary schools are doing for 2 to 5 or whatever, then maybe we're better using our local schools, and the kids don't have to go very far to get there. I mean, I guess when I think about this idea that the buses, kids expect to be picked up by the bus, that sounded really nice to me from Los Angeles moving here, because it felt like your community really cares, and that you're like getting picked up by someone who knows you and going to school. So that's my thought for Friday. And Seth is looking at me crazy, but you know, I just wish we could remember some really big principles for our kids, like our littlest kids, that are what people pay a lot of money for in other contexts, right? That we want all of our kids to have.
If I can ask Senator Rumpensdale to articulate, clarify if you meant, if there's this vision of walking to school, is that elementary, middle, high school?
No, I guess I was vaguely saying like that actually in Japan it's little kids. There's a great show called Old Enough about kids walking to do errands in their little community. I highly recommend it. But I mean, I guess when I say that, they then designed the whole town. So a 3-year-old could walk across the town and come home and pick vegetables on the way and talk to a neighbor and run an errand and go to school. And that, like, just making a policy around how schools work changed the health and the well-being of their entire community. And I just don't want to lose track of, like, that's kind of what I always come back to. I end a lot of my presentations with pictures of little Japanese kids with backpacks, like, because I just think it's my favorite vision of society, honestly. So I guess that's my Friday afternoon comment, is little kids being able to like get around and be part of their community, and schools being a really big part of how we do that.
This plan, I mean, just as part of the overall funding that has been modeled.
Yeah.
Is assuming that we're maintaining our similar portfolio of schools. And there are adjustments that have been made in the model to account for the additional cost for the schools. And so that is where there will be some local decision making within the districts around those choices and what's going to be most important to those local community, assuming they can meet the standards that are set, right?
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
think that's
whole
the other
point.
side of it too, is we do value small, like local elementary schools. We do. We also have to ensure that those kids have the same opportunities as the kids, like my kids go to an elementary school that operates at scale. And when I look at all of the,
What does that mean?
they're at that 450 mark.
Okay.
Right. And when I look at the opportunities that those kids get to have in a wonderful community school and the programming opportunities that they get to have, then we want to just ensure that we preserve that value, but we also want to make sure that the school is offering the same standard and quality. Both of those things can happen.
And my experience is very different. My kids being in a very small rural
Kennedy.
But there's different choices that are made
Yeah.
in terms of how it's staffed and combined grade levels per classroom, and you
Yeah.
make different choices. So there is flexibility within this framework to make choices so that you can prioritize a smaller elementary school.
We have, but
And that's what we're talking about, the delivery.
The delivery
Right,
is
the delivery, there are choices to be made and ways to do this that can honor
Right.
that. But there have to be some changes in.
I guess I'm hoping you also say that the childcare piece going to full time would be built into using more local space in a better way.
So I think what you're referring to are the weights. So for
The chair's trying to say.
Oh,
we
sorry.
have to,
Sorry.
we have to break, but Senator was the very patient, so I want to.
No, I'm gonna wait.
Very much, okay.
You guys aren't gonna go anywhere.
Well, they're coming, they're
We'll be back.
on Wednesday.
So when
Yes.
you say it's a
Yeah.
policy decision, when we set the policy, you guys would be an asset.
So they'll be back here on Wednesday for continuation. Thank you for coming. I just want to say that I know you're trying to improve educational quality in Vermont. I appreciate what you're trying to do. We have to figure out how to make it work, but thank you for leading us along the way.
Given
Okay.
the
We'll
concept.
take a, even though we're
We
late.
appreciate the questions. We
Even
really.
though we're late, we'll take a break until 3:40. So make it really quick, everybody, and then give that